In the pre-dawn gloom of March 1942, the Atlantic Ocean was a vast and unforgiving battleground. The war was not going well for the Allies. U-boats, the gray wolves of the Kriegsmarine, hunted in packs, bleeding the vital convoy routes that supplied Great Britain. But it was not the submarine menace alone that occupied the minds of the Admiralty and the War Cabinet in London. It was a shadow, a ghost that haunted the northern sea lanes, a single, solitary predator of immense power, the German battleship Tirpitz. Sister ship to the infamous Bismarck, the Tirpitz was, by some measures, the most powerful warship afloat in European waters. She was a fortress of steel and cannon, faster than any British battleship, and capable of outgunning almost any vessel sent against her. Winston Churchill himself was obsessed with the threat. He wrote, "The destruction or even the crippling of this ship is the greatest event at sea at the present time. No other target is comparable to it." The Tirpitz represented a strategic concept known as a fleet in being. Merely by existing, she tied down a disproportionate amount of Royal Navy assets. Multiple battleships, aircraft carriers, and their screening fleets had to be kept on high alert in home waters, unable to be deployed to the Pacific or the Mediterranean, just in case the Tirpitz made a sudden sortie into the Atlantic. The fear was that she would break out from her Norwegian fjord lair and unleash havoc upon a convoy, a slaughter from which Allied shipping might never recover. The problem, as strategists at Combined Operations Headquarters studied it, was not just sinking the Tirpitz in a direct confrontation, a risky and potentially catastrophic engagement. The problem was logistical. For a behemoth like the Tirpitz to operate effectively in the vastness of the Atlantic, she required access to a major port, a facility with a dry dock large enough to handle her immense hull for repairs and maintenance. Without such a facility, any damage, even minor, would force her to undertake the perilous journey back through British-controlled waters to her home ports in Germany. The risk of being intercepted, as the Bismarck had been, would be too great, and on the entire Atlantic coast of occupied Europe, from the northern tip of Norway to the Spanish border, there was one and only one dry dock capable of accommodating the Tirpitz. It was the massive Normandy dock, officially known as the Fourme Écluse Joubert, in the heavily fortified French port of Saint-Nazaire. The lock was an engineering marvel, built in the early 1930s to service the grand ocean liner SS Normandy. It was over 1,000 feet long and 160 feet wide. To the German war machine, it was more than a dock. It was a strategic enabler. It was the key that could unlock the full potential of their surface fleet in the Atlantic. British planners therefore arrived at a daring, almost unthinkable conclusion. If they could not be certain of sinking the Tirpitz at sea, they would instead destroy her cradle on the Atlantic. They would eliminate the Normandy dock. By doing so, they would effectively cage the beast in the north, forever neutering her threat to the convoys. The port of Saint-Nazaire would have to be neutralized. But Saint-Nazaire was not an easy target. It was arguably one of the most heavily defended locations on the entire Atlantic wall. Located 6 miles up the Loire estuary, its approaches were protected by treacherous sandbanks and a gauntlet of coastal artillery batteries. The town and the port complex itself were ringed with over 70 anti-aircraft guns from heavy 88mm cannons down to rapid-fire 20mm flak guns. The Luftwaffe maintained a strong fighter presence nearby. Any conventional bombing raid would have to be preternaturally accurate to knock out the specific, hardened targets of the dock and would suffer horrific losses. A seaborne assault seemed even more suicidal. The estuary was a death trap, a channel where any approaching fleet would be systematically annihilated by shore batteries long before it reached the harbor. The planners at Combined Operations, under the command of Lord Louis Mountbatten, specialized in the unconventional. They devised a plan of such breathtaking audacity that it bordered on madness. It was codenamed Operation Chariot. The plan was not to bombard Saint-Nazaire from a distance, nor was it to land an army to capture it. The plan was to deliver a massive explosive charge directly into the heart of the dock itself, using a ship as the delivery mechanism. It was in essence a guided maritime demolition. The core of the operation would be a single, obsolete destroyer, stripped of all non-essential equipment and packed with tons of high explosives, which would be rammed directly into the outer gate, the caisson of the Normandy dock. The vessel chosen for this one-way journey was HMS Campbellton. She was an old ship with a storied past, originally the USS Buchanan, one of 50 First World War-era destroyers given to Britain by the United States as part of the Lend-Lease Agreement. She was old, worn, and destined for the scrapyard. Instead, she was destined for a moment of violent glory. Her transformation for the mission was meticulous. 2 of her 4 funnels were removed, and the remaining 2 were slanted to mimic the distinctive silhouette of a German Moe-class torpedo boat. Every possible pound of weight was stripped out. Her guns were replaced with lighter, rapid-fire Aura Lincolns. And most importantly, deep within her bow was a special compartment constructed. Inside, 24 Mark 7 depth charges containing 4.5 tons of Amitol high explosive were concreted into a single, massive charge. They were linked to a series of pencil detonators, chemical fuses designed to trigger the explosion hours after impact, long after the initial assault. The Campbellton was no longer a warship. She had been reborn as a floating bomb. The ship itself was only part of the equation. To support her, a small flotilla of 18 smaller craft, mostly wooden-hulled motor launches and a single motor gunboat would accompany her up the estuary. These vulnerable vessels had 2 critical tasks. First, to carry the British commandos, who would be the second prong of the attack. Their mission was to disembark from the Campbellton and the launches and, under the cover of darkness and confusion, destroy the dock's vital machinery, the pumping stations, the winch houses, and the mechanisms for the interlock gate.
Second, the little ships were to provide covering fire and then evacuate the commandos and the Campbelltown's crew after the mission was complete. The plan relied on a delicate balance of deception, speed, and overwhelming shock. The psychological component of the strategy was paramount. To even reach the harbor, the flotilla had to navigate 6 miles of the heavily guarded estuary. The only hope of survival was to bluff. The Campbelltown flew the German naval ensign, the Kriegsmarine flag. Her crew had been given fragments of German signal procedure and call signs captured from a recent commando raid. The gamble was that, in the dark, from a distance, the German shore batteries might mistake the approaching force for a friendly patrol. It was a thin hope, a desperate ruse upon which the entire operation depended. On the 26th of March 1942, the force departed from Falmouth, England. On board the Campbelltown and the small launches were some 600 men, Royal Navy sailors and British commandos. They were volunteers, all acutely aware of the slim chances of return. First-hand accounts from veterans speak of a quiet, somber mood as they crossed the English Channel. They were heading for a target so heavily defended that it was known to the Germans as Flak City. Every man understood the calculus of the mission. They were expendable assets, wagered against a target of immense strategic value. After a rendezvous with 2 escorting destroyers and a submarine, which would act as a navigational beacon, the small flotilla began its final, lonely approach on the night of March 27th. The sea was unnaturally calm, the sky clear. At the mouth of the Loire, they slipped past the outer defenses. The German ensign fluttered from the Campbelltown's mast. The tension on the bridge was unbearable. Lieutenant Commander Sam Beatty, the Campbelltown's captain, and Colonel Charles Newman, leader of the Commandos, stood together, peering into the darkness. Their feints seemed to be working. As they moved deeper into the estuary, past the ancient town of Saint Marc, the first German signal lamp blinked at them from the southern shore, challenging the unidentified vessels. A specially trained Royal Navy signalman, using a captured German lamp, flashed back a coded reply. The message was intentionally garbled, a delaying tactic designed to sow confusion. For a few precious minutes, it worked. The German operators hesitated. Who were these ships? What was their purpose? The flotilla pressed on, the low thrum of their engines the only sound in the night. Then, the luck ran out. Just after 1:15 a.m., with the flotilla less than 2 miles from its target, the deception collapsed. Perhaps it was the unfamiliar engine noise or the sheer audacity of the formation. A German searchlight battery on the north bank suddenly snapped on, its brilliant white beams sweeping across the water before locking firmly onto the Campbelltown. In an instant, the night erupted. More searchlights joined the first, pinning the entire flotilla in an inescapable glare. It was as if a curtain had been lifted on a stage. What happened next is preserved in the stark, terrifying language of after-action reports and veteran testimony. A German officer, later interrogated, described the initial confusion. The silhouette of the lead ship was indeed that of a German torpedo boat.
For a moment, some gun crews held their fire, assuming it was a friendly vessel in distress, perhaps having been damaged by the RAF. A German voice boomed out over a loudspeaker from the shore, demanding identification. Lieutenant Commander Beatty, in a final act of defiance and deception, ordered the Kriegsmarine ensign lowered and the Royal Navy's white ensign hoisted. As the British flag caught the searchlight beam, all doubt vanished. Every German gun that could bear on the channel opened fire simultaneously. The flotilla was sailing down what survivors would later call an avenue of fire.
Red, green, and white tracer rounds streaked through the air, converging on the ships from both banks of the river. The heavier cannons of the coastal batteries began to find their range, sending up massive geysers of water that drenched the open decks. The wooden motor launches were particularly vulnerable. They began to take heavy hits, their plywood hulls shredded by cannon shells. Onboard fuel tanks ignited, turning the small boats into raging infernos. Aboard the Campbelltown, the scene was one of disciplined chaos. The ship was being hit repeatedly. Her light Ehrlichen guns returned fire, their streams of tracer a pathetic response to the overwhelming onslaught from the shore. The bridge was struck, wounding several officers. The helmsman was killed at his post, and another sailor immediately took his place, his hands covered in the blood of his comrade. Shrapnel scythed across the open decks where the commandos were huddled, waiting for the impact. Despite the horrific fire, Beatty calmly gave his orders. The engine room, protected deep within the ship's hull, was undamaged. The Campbelltown, her siren screaming in defiance, increased speed for her final run. Through the smoke and the blinding searchlights, the target became visible, the massive dark shape of the Normandy dock's outer caisson. It was a 50-foot-high wall of steel, holding back millions of gallons of water from the Loire. Beatty steered his ship directly towards it. Declassified reports detail the final moments of the approach. With the ship shuddering under constant shell fire and the decks littered with the dead and dying, Beatty ordered, "Stand by to ram." At 1:34 a.m., precisely 4 minutes behind schedule, the HMS Campbelltown, traveling at nearly 20 knots, struck the dock gate. The impact was immense, a deafening shriek of tortured metal. The ship's specially reinforced bow buckled and tore, driving deep into the steel structure of the caisson. The Campbelltown wedged herself firmly into the gate, her forward momentum lifting her bow clear of the water. For a moment an eerie silence descended, broken only by the crackle of fires and the groans of the wounded. Phase 1 of the operation, against all odds, was a success. The floating bomb had been delivered to its target. Now the second phase had to begin. Colonel Newman's voice cut through the aftermath. "Well, here we are. Let's go." The commandos who had been sheltering behind what little cover they could find sprang into action. They threw down rope ladders and scrambling nets and began to pour off the canted deck of the Campbelltown onto the dockside. They landed directly in the heart of the German defenses, into a whirlwind of machine gun and cannon fire. The original plan had called for a controlled, systematic disembarkation. Instead, it was a desperate scramble for survival.
Many were cut down before they even touched the ground. The commando force was divided into demolition and protection teams. Their objectives had been memorized from aerial photographs and detailed models. Amidst the chaos of the German response, these small groups of men set off into the darkness of the sprawling dockyard to perform their tasks. Their targets were the machinery that made the dock function. One team, under the command of Lieutenant Stuart Chant, fought its way to the main pumping house, a critical target. Under intense fire, they placed their explosive charges, set the fuses, and withdrew. The resulting explosion tore the roof from the building and shattered the intricate machinery within. Another team targeted the winding house for the inner caisson, destroying the powerful winches that operated the gate. Other groups laid charges on bridges and gun emplacements. The fighting was at point-blank range, a brutal series of skirmishes in the shadows of cranes and warehouses. The commandos were heavily outnumbered, but their training and the sheer shock of their appearance gave them a temporary advantage. The Germans, initially believing they were facing a major invasion force, were slow to coordinate an effective counterattack. While the land battle raged, the situation for the small boats in the estuary had become a catastrophe. The motor launches, tasked with evacuating the commandos, were being systematically destroyed. Their wooden hulls offered no protection, and their gasoline engines made them floating pyres when hit. One after another, they were crippled or sunk. Their crews and the commando teams they carried suffered appalling casualties. The water was filled with burning wreckage and desperate men. The withdrawal plan had disintegrated. On the docks, Colonel Newman soon realized the hopelessness of his position. With most of the evacuation flotilla destroyed, there was no escape by sea. His force was isolated, low on ammunition, and surrounded by a rapidly growing number of German troops. Shortly after 3 a.m., with most of the primary demolition objectives achieved, Newman gave the only order he could: every man for himself. He organized a group to attempt to break out, to fight their way through the town of Saint-Nazaire and try to reach the French countryside, hoping to link up with the French resistance. What followed was a desperate running battle through the streets of the town. Small groups of commandos, exhausted and bloodied, fought from house to house, trying to break the German cordon. But the odds were impossible. By daylight, most had been killed or forced to surrender. Of more than 600 men who had set out on the raid, only a handful would make it back to England. Colonel Newman himself was captured.
The Germans believed they had crushed the attack and secured the port. As the sun rose on the morning of March 28th, the scene at Saint-Nazaire was one of German victory. The smoking hulks of the British motor launches littered the estuary. The docks were a scene of carnage, but the vital Normandy dock itself appeared to only be superficially damaged. The British destroyer was wedged awkwardly in the gate, a trophy of the night's battle. German officers, engineers, and even civilians swarmed over the captured vessel, inspecting the damage, taking photographs, and congratulating themselves on their swift and effective defense. They searched the ship for explosives, but found nothing.
The main charge, silent and hidden deep within the bow, concreted into the very structure of the ship, was undetectable. The British prisoners, when interrogated, said nothing about it. The hours ticked by. The Germans began salvage and repair operations. A party of senior German officers and civilian dignitaries was being given a tour of the captured ship, celebrating their triumph. The raid, it seemed, had been a costly and heroic failure for the British. Then, at 10:35 a.m., nearly 9 hours after the initial impact, the chemical fuses in the bow of the HMS Campbelltown completed their slow, silent work. The detonation was cataclysmic. 4.5 tons of amachule exploded with unimaginable force. The entire forward section of the Campbelltown disintegrated. The 50-foot-high, 1,600-ton steel caisson, which had held firm against the initial ramming, was torn apart and vaporized in the blast. A colossal wall of water from the Loire estuary, released from its restraint, surged into the now empty dry dock. The tidal wave swept everything before it, wrecking 2 German tankers that were being refitted inside and scouring the dock clean. The force of the explosion and the subsequent flood killed an estimated 360 German soldiers and civilians, including most of the delegation that had been inspecting the ship. The blast was so powerful it was felt from miles around. The raid was not yet over. The Germans, reeling from the massive explosion, were thrown into a state of panic and paranoia. Their confusion was compounded when, that afternoon and over the next 2 days, further explosions rocked the harbor. These were caused by delayed action torpedoes fired by a British motor torpedo boat during the initial assault. The German command, unable to comprehend the source of these new detonations, believed that Commandos were still at large, continuing their work of sabotage. In their fear, German soldiers began firing at French dock workers, believing they were part of the raiding force, leading to tragic civilian casualties. The final analysis of Operation Chariot presents a stark paradox. In tactical terms, it was a near disaster. Of the 611 men who took part, 169 were killed and over 200 were captured. Only 228 men returned to Britain. Of the 18 small ships in the flotilla, only 4 survived. The human cost was staggering. Yet in strategic terms, the raid was one of the most brilliant and decisive successes of the entire war. The Normandy dock was completely destroyed and would not be repaired for the remainder of the conflict. First-hand accounts from captured German naval staff later confirmed the profound impact of the raid. The loss of the Saint-Nazaire facility meant that the Tirpitz could never safely operate in the Atlantic. She was permanently confined to her Norwegian fjords, where she was eventually crippled by RAF bombers and finally sunk by Lancaster bombers carrying massive tallboy bombs in November 1944. The greatest event at sea, as Churchill had called it, had been achieved not by a grand fleet action, but by one old destroyer and a few hundred incredibly brave men. The sheer courage displayed during the raid was recognized with an unprecedented number of gallantry awards. 89 decorations were awarded, including 5 Victoria Crosses, the highest honor for valor.
They were awarded to Lieutenant Commander Beatty, Colonel Newman, and others who displayed extraordinary leadership and bravery in the face of impossible odds. Declassified documents and the careful collation of archival footage and veteran testimony have allowed us to piece together the full story of this remarkable operation. It was a mission born of desperation, a cold-blooded calculation that weighed the lives of hundreds of men against a strategic prize of incalculable worth. It was a testament to the idea that in warfare, audacity, ingenuity, and the raw courage of the individual soldier can sometimes overcome overwhelming material and numerical superiority. The German harbor had saluted the destroyer, a gesture of confused respect for what they thought was one of their own. They did not realize they were greeting a Trojan horse of steel and high explosive, a harbinger of their own strategic defeat in the Battle of the Atlantic. The silent, wrecked ship they clambered over was not a trophy, but a time bomb, ticking down the final seconds to one of the most audacious and successful acts of destruction in modern military history. Thanks for watching. We are curious to hear about your anecdotes or thoughts on this story. Please comment them down below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to World War Echoes so that you never miss out on our daily stories about World War II. Take care.